In 1971, a company called Rival set a humble stoneware pot on American store shelves with a promise that sounded like magic. Cooks all day while the cook's away. By the middle of the decade, millions were plugged in on avocado green counters from coast to coast. Mom flipped it to low before the morning school run, and by 6 o'clock, the whole house smelled like Sunday. These are the 25 forgotten Crock-Pot dinners every 1970s family came home to. The cheap cuts, the canned soup shortcuts, the recipes clipped from the back of a soup mix box. Number 9 brought a little Italy to a Tuesday. Number 3 showed up at every church potluck in America. And number 1 was the smell that meant everything was going to be okay. Hit subscribe, and let's begin the countdown at number 25. Number 25. Lima beans and ham hocks simmered at the bottom of the crock-pot in homes where nothing edible ever hit the trash. A smoked ham hock cost pocket change at the butcher counter, sometimes tossed in free after a holiday spiral ham, and a bag of dried limas ran under 50 cents. Mom rinsed the beans before work, layered them over the hock with an onion and a bay leaf, covered it all with water, and left it to whisper on low for 9 hours. By evening, the beans had gone soft and creamy, the broth thick with smoke and marrow, the meat falling away in pale shreds. Kids groaned at the sight of lima beans, then cleaned their bowls with a heel of white bread. It was Depression cooking passed down to the disco decade, proof that the cheapest supper on the block could still fill a growing family to the brim. Number 24. Smoked sausage and sauerkraut carried the flavor of the old country into Midwestern kitchens, especially where German and Polish grandparents had settled generations back. A ring of kielbasa, or a rope of smoked sausage, went in whole, nestled into a bag of drained sauerkraut with a spoon of brown sugar, a sliced onion, and sometimes a peeled potato or two. 6 hours on low turned the kraut mellow and golden, its sharp bite softened by the fat rendering slowly from the sausage. The smell was unmistakable, tangy and rich, drifting out to the driveway before Dad's car even hit the garage. Served with rye bread and a smear of yellow mustard, it cost barely $1 to feed the whole table. Kids picked out the potatoes first. It was a weeknight supper that asked almost nothing of the cook and gave back warmth on the coldest February nights. Number 23. Porcupine meatballs earned their strange name honestly. Little grains of rice poked out of each ball like quills as they cooked. Mom mixed ground beef with raw white rice, a diced onion, and a beaten egg, rolled the mixture into balls, and dropped them into a can of tomato soup thinned with water. The rice cooked right inside the meat, swelling and softening over the long afternoon, absorbing the tomato until every bite was tender and tangy. A single pound of hamburger stretched into 24 meatballs, enough to feed a family with leftovers for lunch. Children loved the name and the novelty, counting the little spikes before they dug in. It was a recipe born of thrift and printed on the back of 100 soup cans, a clever trick that turned the cheapest ground beef and a nickel's worth of rice into a supper kids actually asked for. Number 22, paprika chicken, or chicken paprikash, brought a splash of Hungarian warmth to American tables long after the families who carried it over had melted into the suburbs. Bone-in chicken pieces went into the pot over sliced onions, dusted generously with sweet paprika until everything glowed a deep, rusty red. It cooked low and slow until the meat slid off the bone. And then, in the final stretch, Mom stirred in a carton of sour cream to turn the sauce silky and rich. Ladled over wide egg noodles, it was Sunday supper special on a Tuesday budget. The paprika perfumed the whole kitchen, and the sauce, blush pink and glossy, clung to every noodle. Kids mopped their plates clean. It was comfort food with an accent, a dish that carried memory in every spoonful and proved a crock-pot could do far more than stew. Number 21. Chicken and rice was the quiet workhorse of the weeknight, a one-pot supper that asked for a can, a cup, and almost no attention. Mom layered chicken pieces over raw rice, poured a can of cream of mushroom or cream of chicken soup on top, filled the empty can with milk, and let it go. Hours later, the rice had drunk up the soup and gone tender and creamy, the chicken falling apart at the touch of a fork. Sometimes a handful of frozen peas or a sprinkle of paprika dressed it up for company. It cost under $2 to make and fed everyone at the table. Kids liked how the rice went soft and buttery at the edges. Plain, filling, and endlessly forgiving. It was the supper a busy mother could throw together in the 4 minutes between the lunch dishes and the carpool. Number 20. Barbecue country-style ribs turned the toughest, cheapest cut of pork into fall-apart tenderness that tasted like a backyard cookout in the dead of winter. Country-style ribs ran cheap at the meat counter, meaty and full of connective tissue that needed hours of low heat to surrender. Mom stacked them in the pot, drowned them in a bottle of hickory barbecue sauce, and walked away. By supper, the meat had gone soft enough to eat with a spoon. The sauce cooked down thick and sticky and clinging to every rib. The house smelled like smoke and molasses. Kids gnawed the bones clean and licked their fingers, and the paper towels ran out fast. Served with white bread to soak up the sauce, it was messy, sweet, and gloriously cheap. A pot of ribs meant a good night, no grill required, and no summer sun needed. Number 19, pork chops in mushroom gravy. Rescued the thin, cheap, easily overcooked chop from its usual fate of dry and gray. Mom browned the chops in a skillet if she had the morning minute, then slid them into the crock-pot under a blanket of cream of mushroom soup and sliced onions. Hours of gentle heat did what a hot pan never could, coaxing the lean meat into something tender and forgiving, wrapped in a gravy gone deep and savory. Spooned over mashed potatoes or a mound of white rice, it was the kind of stick-to-your-rib supper that met Dad at the door after a long shift. The gravy was the whole point, thick and speckled and begging to be sopped up with a dinner roll. It was proof that a can of soup and a little patience could turn the humblest chop into a plate worth coming home to. Number 18. Swedish meatballs bubbled away in a creamy gravy that made them the undisputed star of the 1970s dinner party and the church fellowship hall alike. Mom rolled ground beef and pork with breadcrumbs and a whisper of nutmeg and allspice, browned them, then let them simmer in a sauce of cream of mushroom soup and sour cream until the whole thing turned velvety. Kept warm on low, the crock-pot doubled as a serving dish, and guests speared meatballs with toothpicks straight from the crock. Over egg noodles, it became supper. On a buffet table, it became the appetizer everyone circled back to. The little meatballs glistened in their pale gravy, and the toothpick jar emptied fast. It was potluck royalty, a dish that signaled the hostess had gone to some trouble, even if the crock-pot had quietly done every bit of the work. Number 17. Shredded barbecue beef sandwiches took a stubborn chuck roast and turned it into a pile of tender, saucy meat that fed a crowd on game day or a family for 2 nights running. The roast went in whole with a bottle of barbecue sauce and a splash of cola or a spoon of brown sugar, and the low heat did the rest. Hours later, Mom pulled it apart with 2 forks, the meat surrendering into juicy shreds that drank up the sauce. Piled onto a soft hamburger bun, it was sloppy, sweet, and deeply satisfying. Kids needed a fistful of napkins and didn't care. Cheap enough to make in bulk, it stretched a few dollars of tough beef across a table full of hungry mouths. Whether it was called barbecue beef or shredded beef, it was the sandwich that turned a lazy Sunday afternoon into a feast. Number 16. Stuffed green peppers stood upright in the crock-pot like little edible cups, a supper that looked far fancier than its grocery bills suggested. Mom hollowed out green bell peppers, filled them with a mix of ground beef, cooked rice, onion, and a spoon of tomato, then stood them shoulder to shoulder in the crock and poured tomato sauce over the top. The long, slow steam softened the peppers until they slumped and sweetened, the filling inside going tender and savory. The kitchen filled with the smell of tomato and beef by late afternoon. Each person got their own pepper, which made even a Tuesday feel a little special. Kids either loved them or picked out the filling and left the shell behind. Cheap, colorful, and self-portioned, stuffed peppers were the kind of dish that made a thrifty mother look like she had really tried. Number 15. Vegetable beef soup was the great clean-out-the-crisper supper, a pot that swallowed whatever the week had left behind and turned it into something nourishing. A cheap soup bone or a handful of stew meat went in with a can of tomatoes, an onion, and whatever vegetables were lingering. Carrots, celery, potatoes, a scoop of frozen mixed vegetables from the freezer door. Water covered it all, and the crock-pot murmured through the day until the broth turned rich and the meat went tender. It cost almost nothing and fed a family for pennies a bowl. The steam fogged the kitchen windows against the cold outside, and a sleeve of saltines always sat beside the pot. Kids fished for the potatoes and the little cubes of beef. Humble and endlessly variable, it was the soup that proved a good supper never needed a recipe, only a pot and a little time. Number 14. Ham and navy bean soup was the reward for a holiday ham, the second act that turned the picked-over bone into a week's worth of dinners. Mom dropped the ham bone into a bag of soaked navy beans, added an onion and a carrot, covered it with water, and let it go from morning till night. The beans slowly broke down and thickened the broth into something almost creamy, the smoke from the bone working its way into every spoonful. Bits of ham, still clinging to the bone, fell away into the pot. It cost next to nothing, built entirely from scraps that might otherwise have been thrown out. Served with cornbread or crackers, it was a supper of pure thrift and comfort. Kids didn't always love the beans, but they loved the ham. It was frugality turned delicious, the kind of soup that tasted even better on the second day. Number 13, split PA soup carried the same spirit, a thick green pot built around a ham bone and a bag of dried peas that cost less than a candy bar. The split peas dissolved almost entirely over the long, slow cook, melting into a broth so thick a spoon could nearly stand in it. The ham bone gave up its smoke and salt, and a diced onion, carrot, and celery rounded out the flavor. By supper, the soup had gone the deep, murky green that children eyed with suspicion, and adults recognized as pure comfort. The smell hung in the kitchen for hours, earthy and warm. A pot of it fed the family for 2 nights and cost barely $1. It was old-world cooking, cheap and filling, the kind of supper that stuck to the ribs and carried a working family straight through a cold, dark evening. Number 12. Stuffed cabbage rolls, called gołąbki in Polish kitchens and holuszkas in others, were a labor of love that the crock-pot finally made easy. Mom softened cabbage leaves in boiling water, then rolled each one around a filling of ground beef, rice, and onion, tucking the little bundles seam-side down into the pot. A blanket of tomato sauce went over the top, and the low heat did the slow work that once demanded a watched oven. Hours later, the cabbage had gone silky and the filling tender, the whole thing swimming in a sweet and tangy tomato bath. The dish carried the memory of grandmothers and old countries, a taste of Sunday dinner in an immigrant kitchen. It took patience to assemble, but nothing to cook. Kids ate the filling and sometimes the leaves. It was heritage on a plate, a recipe worth every fold and roll. Number 11. Beef and noodles was Midwestern comfort at its plainest and most beloved. A bowl of tender beef and thick noodles in a rich brown gravy that needed nothing else. A cheap chuck roast or a package of stew meat cooked down all day until it shredded, the broth thickening into gravy, and then wide egg noodles went in for the last stretch to drink up all that flavor. Served over mashed potatoes, because carbs on carbs was never a crime in a 1970s kitchen, it was the ultimate stick-to-your-ribs supper. The smell of beef and onions filled the house by afternoon. Kids came in from the cold and asked what was for dinner before they'd even shut the door. Simple, hearty, and cheap, beef and noodles was the kind of meal nobody photographed and everybody remembered. A plain bowl of pure home. Number 10. American goulash bore little resemblance to its Hungarian namesake, but every family that made it swore by their version. It was ground beef, elbow macaroni, canned tomatoes, and onion, seasoned with a little garlic, and simmered until the flavors married and the macaroni went soft. Some called it slumgullion, some called it American chop suey, but on the plate it was the same beloved jumble of beef and noodles in a thick tomato sauce. It cost almost nothing and stretched a single pound of hamburger to feed a whole table. A shake of Parmesan from the green can finished it off. Kids devoured it, and leftovers reheated even better the next day. It was the definition of a weeknight dinner, unfussy and filling, the kind of pot that emptied fast and left everyone reaching for seconds before the first bowl was even cold. Number 9. Chicken cacciatore brought a little Italian-American flair to the supper rotation, a rustic hunter's stew that felt fancy but cost like a weeknight. Bone-in chicken pieces went into the pot with a can of tomatoes, sliced onions and peppers, garlic, and a shake of oregano, and the low heat pulled everything together into a rich, herby sauce. By evening, the chicken was falling from the bone, and the peppers had gone soft and sweet. Ladled over spaghetti, it was the kind of meal that made a Tuesday feel like a night out at the corner Italian place. The whole house smelled of tomato and oregano. Kids twirled their noodles and asked for more sauce. It stretched a cheap package of chicken across the whole family and proved the Crock-Pot could speak Italian just as easily as it spoke pot roast. Number 8. Sloppy Joes bubbled in the Crock-Pot for church suppers, scout meetings, and any night a crowd needed feeding fast and cheap. Ground beef browned with onion, then simmered in a sweet and tangy tomato sauce, sometimes from a can of Manwich, sometimes from Mom's own mix of ketchup, brown sugar, and mustard. Kept warm on low, the pot let everyone serve themselves, spooning the loose, saucy meat onto soft hamburger buns that soaked through by the second bite. It was gloriously messy, the kind of dinner that required a napkin tucked into the collar and a plate held close. Kids adored them, sauce running down their wrists. Cheap enough to make by the gallon, Sloppy Joes fed a mob for a few dollars and left everyone happy. It was the ultimate casual supper, a sandwich that never once pretended to be neat. Number 7. Swiss steak took a tough, cheap, round steak and pounded, floured, and braised it into fork-tender submission. Mom dredged the meat in seasoned flour, browned it hard in a skillet, then laid it in the crock-pot beneath a smother of canned tomatoes, onions, and celery. The long, slow braise broke down every stubborn fiber until the steak could be cut with the side of a fork, all of it swimming in a thick, tangy tomato gravy, served over mashed potatoes or egg noodles. It was hearty, homey, and unmistakably a supper somebody's mother had made. The tomato and onion filled the kitchen with a savory, comforting smell. Kids soaked up the gravy with bread. It was the alchemy the Crock-Pot did best, taking the cheapest cut in the meat case and turning it, over the course of a quiet afternoon, into something tender and rich. Number 6. Chicken and dumplings was Sunday comfort distilled into a single pot, a dish that tasted like a grandmother's kitchen no matter whose it came from. A whole chicken or a package of thighs, cooked down all day with onion and celery until the meat fell from the bone and the broth turned golden and rich. Then, in the final hour, Mom dropped in the dumplings, sometimes spoonfuls of biscuit dough, sometimes strips of flour and water, and let them steam into pillowy softness on top of the bubbling stew. The result was creamy, savory, and endlessly comforting, the kind of meal that fogged the windows and warmed the whole house. Kids fished for the doughy dumplings first. It cost little and delivered everything, a supper that felt like a hug on a plate and asked for nothing but a little patience in return. Number 5. Beef stroganoff was the height of the 1970s dinner party sophistication, a dish that felt worldly and expensive but leaned entirely on the trusty can of cream of mushroom soup. Cubes of beef, or ground beef on a tighter budget, simmered all day with onions and mushrooms until tender, and then a carton of sour cream went in at the end to turn the sauce luxuriously creamy. Ladled over a bed of wide egg noodles, it was the meal Mom made when company was coming or when a Wednesday just needed to feel special. The sauce was pale and glossy, the beef meltingly soft. Kids thought the noodles were the best part. It sounded fancy and Russian and impressive, and nobody at the table needed to know it had come together from a soup can and an afternoon of doing absolutely nothing. That was the quiet genius of it. Number 4. Corned beef and cabbage crowned the table every March, but plenty of families made it year-round because the Crock-Pot handled it so beautifully. A brined corned beef brisket, cheapest right after St. Patrick's Day, went into the pot with its little seasoning packet, covered in water, and left to simmer for the better part of a day. In the final hours, Mom added wedges of cabbage, chunks of potato, and carrots to cook in the salty, spiced broth. The meat emerged tender enough to slice against the grain into pink, savory ribbons. The smell was unmistakable, sharp and briny and filling the whole house. Kids ate around the cabbage, served with mustard and a slice of rye. It was a feast that cost surprisingly little. It was the one supper that turned an ordinary weeknight into something that felt, briefly, like a holiday. Number 3. Chili con carne was the Crock-Pot's crowning glory, the dish that showed up at every church potluck, tailgate, and chili Friday night in America. Ground beef browned with onion, then simmered for hours with canned tomatoes, kidney beans, chili powder, and cumin until the whole thing went thick and deep red and rich. The long, slow cook let the spices bloom and the flavors meld into something no quick pot on the stove could match. Topped with shredded cheddar, a dollop of sour cream, and a handful of crackers, or a square of cornbread. It was supper, party food, and comfort all at once. The smell of chili powder and beef filled the house for hours. Kids loaded on the cheese. Cheap, forgiving, and better. The second day, chili was the recipe that sold 1 million crock-pots and earned every bit of its fame. Number 2, beef stew was the reason many families bought a crock-pot in the first place. The perfect marriage of cheap ingredients and the machine built to transform them. Cubes of chuck or stew meat went in with potatoes, carrots, onions, and celery, all of it swimming in a broth thickened with a little flour or a packet of gravy mix. 9 hours on low turned the toughest beef fork tender and married every vegetable into one deep, savory pot. Mom set it in the morning and came home to a house that smelled like supper had been cooking for days. The steam fogged the windows against the winter dark. Kids came in from the cold, lifted the lid, and breathed it in. Served with crusty bread, it fed the family for pennies, a bowl. Hearty, humble, and endlessly satisfying. Beef stew was the Crock-Pot doing exactly what it was born to do. And finally, number 1, pot roast was the undisputed king of the Crock-Pot, the Sunday supper that came to define an entire decade of American home cooking. A cheap chuck roast, the kind that would chew like leather if you rushed it, went into the pot over onions and carrots and potatoes. And then, in the move that launched 1,000 family recipes, Mom emptied a packet of onion soup mix over the top. Sometimes a can of cream of mushroom joined it. Then the lid went on, the dial went to low, and everyone left for the day. 8 or 9 hours later, they walked back into a house transformed. The roast fallen apart into tender shreds, the gravy dark and savory, the vegetables soaked through with beef and onion. The smell hit the moment the door opened, and it meant home. It meant Sunday. It meant that whatever the day had held, supper was ready and the family was together. It was the cheapest cut in the case turned into the centerpiece of the week. The dish that proved a busy mother could leave in the morning and still come home to something that tasted like she'd been cooking all day. That was the magic rival had promised, and the pot roast delivered it every single time. That's our countdown of the 25 forgotten crock-pot dinners every 1970s family came home to, from lima beans and ham hocks all the way up to that Sunday pot roast. These were the suppers that fed a generation on a shoestring, cooked all day while the cook was away. Which one did your family make? Which smell takes you straight back to a harvest gold kitchen? Tell me in the comments, and if this brought back a memory, hit that like button and subscribe, because these weren't just dinners, they were the taste of coming home.